2001 will go down as one of the most impactful years for video games. Halo Combat Evolved was a huge step for first-person shooters on consoles and helped establish the Xbox brand. Metal Gear Solid 2 pushed cinematic storytelling to all new heights, using the medium to enhance the narrative instead of detracting from it. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because I can go on all day listing landmark titles. However, I want to focus on one of my favorite games of that year, and what is probably one of the most influential titles in the action genre. That game, of course, being Capcom's very own For those who are unaware, the Devil May Cry games are a series of hack and slashes where the goal is to take down rooms of enemies while looking as stylish as possible. The main appeal for this series is the mechanical depth and over-the-top action, which was something that not many 3D games were providing at the time. Most of the discussion surrounding Devil May Cry is focused on the later entries in the series, with the original game often being left out. This is a shame because Devil May Cry 1, while comparatively more simplistic, is a fulfilling experience in its own way and deserves to be recognized for what it managed to accomplish. So for today's video, we're going to be doing just that, and taking a deep dive into the mechanics and design of Devil May Cry in order to see what exactly made it such a revolutionary title. Of course, it goes without saying that there are going to be spoilers throughout this video. Not that that really means anything, because the narrative of DMC isn't anything to write home about. It's nothing bad, but it isn't at the forefront of the experience. A few thousand years ago, a war broke out between the human world and the underworld. A lone demon named Sparta rose up and fought back against the demonic forces to protect humanity, which would earn him the title of the legendary Dark Knight. After the war, Sparta would go on and reside in the human world, where he would fall in love with a human named Eva and act as their guardian until his eventual death. The protagonist of this story is Sparta's son, Dante, a half-human demon hunter who runs a shop named Devil May Cry. Dante's mother and older brother Virgil were ruthlessly slaughtered by demons over 20 years ago, and Dante has been running his business in hopes of getting revenge on the demon responsible. One night, a mysterious woman named Trish visits Dante's shop with a request. The Prince of Darkness Mundus, who was previously defeated by Sparta, has made his return and is planning on opening the gates of the underworld once again. Dante agrees to help out, not just so he can avenge his family, but because Trish looks awfully similar to his own mother. The duo heads to Malay Island and split up in order to search for Mundus and put a stop to his plans. That's the basic setup to Devil May Cry, and from here on out, the story largely takes a back seat. DMC 1 is very light on plot, and it more so exists to provide the player with context as to why they're exploring these locations to begin with. However, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because for how simplistic the story is, it makes up for it in the characterization of Dante. He's the epitome of the 80s action hero. He's got a cocky personality and spouts plenty of wisecracks at the expense of his enemies. But above all else, Dante loves to show off. This is portrayed both in the cutscene dialogue as well as in the gameplay animations and mechanics. What makes Dante such an entertaining character to watch is the way he interacts with the bosses he comes across. The stark contrast between the super serious ancient demons and the more contemporary lighthearted hero provides us with some good banter. While Dante is very playful and mocking, it isn't to the point where he becomes irritating, and in the latter half of the game, his character is developed a bit further beyond the surface level. During the last stretch of the story, it's revealed that Trish was a demon created by Mundus in order to lure Dante into a trap. Despite her betrayal, Dante ends up saving Trish's life because of her resemblance to his mother. This says a lot about the kind of person Dante is. While he cracks a lot of jokes and is generally presented as a pretty laid-back and confident guy, there's a part of him that feels some sort of regret and guilt for not being able to protect his family all those years ago. When Trish ends up taking a fatal blow for him, Dante feels as though he let himself down again, with striking Mundus down being the only way to make amends. It's not the deepest or most complex idea in the world, but it goes a long way in humanizing this character and making him a bit more down to earth. Another aspect of this story that I really like is how they build up Mundus as a threat. The few times we see Mundus throughout the game before his boss battle, he's represented by a pair of sinister glowing eyes. The first time we get a glimpse at Mundus and his power is after the third boss fight against Griffin. He expresses his disappointment in his servant, and without a second thought, Mundus obliterates the demon in a single attack. This is a great way to get the player's mind wandering about the antagonist. Griffin can be a pretty tricky fight for a first-time player, and seeing the final boss destroy him like he was nothing, it gives you a clear idea of what you're up against without taking away from the intrigue. Mundus' true form isn't even shown to the player until the very end of the game. During his boss battle, he takes the form of a stone statue that resembles the common depiction of God. But as his ego is shattered and Mundus becomes more desperate to kill Dante, his shell begins to crumble and his more grotesque true form form is revealed. This is a contrast that's meant to highlight that even though Mundus thinks very highly of himself, at the end of the day, he's nothing more than just a pitiful demon. And through the assistance of Trish, Dante is able to land the killing blow to the Prince of Darkness, finally avenging his family. As I said, the story of Devil May Cry 1 isn't anything special, but it's still pretty entertaining. While things are a bit cheesy at points, there's enough earnesty in the more somber moments for them to be effective. However, something that's impossible to overlook is the quality of the voice acting. For the most part, characters sound fine. The direction is a bit wooden at points, but I think it gets the job done. The issue is that scenes that are supposed to be touching don't stick the landing because of the performances. Some of these lines definitely needed a few more takes, or at the very least, be rewritten so that they could come off more naturally. You know exactly which scene I'm talking about when I say that. I'm not sure what they were going for here, but it's so bad that it bounces back into being hilarious.
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light.
I mostly talked about the story here out of a formality, since, let's be honest, the narrative was never the selling point. However, I do think that it's worth acknowledging that, as the first game in the series, Devil May Cry does a pretty good job at introducing us to this universe concisely and clearly, while also leaving room open for future titles to expand upon. But you're not playing Devil May Cry for the story. The main appeal for this series has always been in its mechanical depth and blood-pumping combat, so how does DMC1 fare after all this time? Honestly, it holds up much better than you'd think. Devil May Cry, at its core, is easy to learn, hard to master. You have two separate methods of attacking. There are your standard melee attacks, and a long-ranged option in the form of firearms. At the start of the game, you only have access to your sword and dual pistols. While that might seem very limiting at first, this is actually a very good design choice, since it allows the game to drill the basics into your head instead of overwhelming you with attacks. By experimenting with button combinations, you'll quickly discover that you have a decent selection of moves at your disposal. The standard 3-hit sword combo can be thrown out just by mashing the attack button. However, 2 more sword combos can be performed by timing your button presses correctly. You also have access to a launcher that requires you to press the attack button while holding back on the analog stick. This move can then be chained into more sword attacks, or you can use the opportunity to bust out your guns to keep the enemy suspended in the air. While Ebony and Ivory don't pack much of a punch, they can be quite handy in a few situations, though you're better off sticking to your sword most of the time. While these attacks are going to be your bread and butter throughout a playthrough, you'll quickly start to unlock more options as you progress. Either that be because of new weapons you find in the environment, or by spending red orbs to purchase new skills. Dante has a total of 4 melee weapons and 4 firearms to choose from, though that number is a bit skewed since 3 of those melee weapons are variations of the default sword. For most of the game, you're going to be using the sword Alistair, which is obtained at the start of the second mission. While its basic moves are the same as your initial blade, an exclusive mechanic to this sword is the ability to activate Devil Trigger. As you deal damage to enemies, you'll slowly fill up these runes underneath your health bar. Once you have a minimum of 3 runes, you can activate Devil Trigger. Devil Trigger buffs your attacks, increases your movement speed, gives you passive health regeneration, and even allows you to perform some exclusive attacks. The final sword you unlock is Sparta, named after Dante's father. You can't activate Devil Trigger while this weapon is equipped, but the trade-off is that your attacks naturally deal more damage and reach further. To be honest, I don't use Sparta that much, because the extra damage isn't worth losing combat options for. I can think of a few times where it came in handy, but outside of the odd scenario, I find Alistair to be the superior option. The final weapon, however, is where things get interesting. The Ifra Gauntlets are far slower than the swords, but they pack one hell of a punch, especially if you decide to charge up the attacks. Its move pool is a bit more limited than the swords, but it makes up for it in the raw damage you can output, which can be increased even further with Devil Trigger. On the flip side, guns are much more simple compared to the melee weapons, but they serve a practical purpose. I already talked about Ebony and Ivory, but you also eventually get access to a shotgun, grenade launcher, and a special weapon called Nightmare Type B. The former two are very self-explanatory, but the latter functions a bit differently. Nightmare Type B is a laser cannon that can be found near the end of the game. It does decent damage, and the shot fired can ricochet off the walls, potentially hitting enemies multiple times. Unlike the other weapons, Nightmare Type B draws from the Devil Trigger gauge with each use. You can also spend even more of the Devil Trigger meter to charge up the blast and deal some serious damage. On a surface level, Devil May Cry shares a lot of similarities to old school beat-em-up titles. However, what sets this game apart from the others is the way it encourages clever uses of the mechanics. One of the most recognizable aspects of the Devil May Cry games is the combat ranking system. It's been a staple since the first game, though it functions a bit differently here. As you attack enemies, your combo ranking at the top right of the screen will increase. This rank will change from dull all the way up to stylish. Unlike the later games in the series, your combo rank is determined by the number of consecutive hits you land, rather than the variety of moves you pull off. While you might think you can just mash the attack button and earn a stylish rank, this is actually a suboptimal way of playing. Every combo ends with an attack that sends enemies away from Dante. The key differences lie in the number of hits you perform before landing the final blow. You're meant to evaluate the situation and determine which combo you should be using. The style system also heavily encourages you to stay engaged with fights, since guns only build your ranking by either using double trigger or through juggling. If you waste too much time in between hits, your current style ranking will reset. While this might seem overly punishing at first, this is actually done to encourage the use of another major mechanic. By pressing the right trigger, Dante will perform a taunt. While this might seem like just a way to show off, it serves an important gameplay purpose. Whenever you perform a taunt, it extends the duration of your rank long enough for you to continue the combo on another enemy. This is pretty useful on its own, but taunting also has a secondary purpose since it can be used to restore your double trigger gauge. Taunting is such a great mechanic. Taunting can very easily be punished if used at an improper time since you need to put yourself in potential danger. However, a player that has mastered the mechanics of the game and is willing to show off a bit will not only look super cool, but they'll be rewarded for taking that risk. Ranking isn't just limited to your combat performance, since you're also graded at the end of each stage and will be rewarded with red orbs depending on your rank. This rank is influenced by a few factors, such as the time it took for you to complete the stage, the number of red orbs you collected, and how much damage you took. A common misconception I hear is that your combat rank affects your end stage rank. All your combat ranking does is influence the number of red orbs that are dropped by defeated enemies, so it's possible to S-rank a stage without having the best combat rank, as long as you've fulfilled the other requirements. All of this sounds very straightforward on paper, but if you think that getting an S-rank is going to be a walk in the park, then you've got another thing coming. Devil May Cry 1 is a fairly difficult game, especially for a first-time player. Enemies are very aggressive and can be fairly tricky when you first encounter them. Sin Scythes and Blades are notable examples since they're the first common enemies that can block your attacks. Fetishes can also occasionally perform a counterattack that deals a good chunk of damage if you aren't prepared for it. The game's challenge is at the core of the experience, and most of the time, it's a pretty fair one. However, there are a few beginner's traps. Some cutscenes end with the enemies starting their attacks, and you're only given a split second to react. A first-time player would have no idea that this is going to happen, which leads to unfair damage. I can count the number of times that this happened on one hand, but it doesn't change the fact that it's bullshit. But at the end of the day, Devil May Cry is built around replayability. The more you play the game, the easier it becomes to pick up on enemy tells, and you'll figure out tricks to quickly take care of demons. Let's use the first boss fight against Phantom as an example. One of Phantom's attacks is a fireball that comes out fast and does decent damage if you get hit. A first-time player will most likely jump out of the way of this move whenever possible. However, much later in the game, you're taught that you can deflect projectiles back at the opponent. This is demonstrated with the same attack that Phantom uses. You then take this knowledge into subsequent playthroughs and realize that you can deflect Phantom's attacks back at him. During his second fight, you might notice the shards of glass that are thrown about whenever Phantom jumps onto the skylight. If you manage to trick him into doing this 5 times, the skylight will shatter and instantly end the fight. Not only is this stylish as hell, but hidden tricks like this are littered throughout the game. Complex combat isn't just limited to what the player has at their disposal. It also extends to what the enemies can do and how you're able to interact with them. The fact that this philosophy existed all the way back to the first game of the series is nothing short of impressive. Look, I've been gassing up Devil May Cry 1 for pretty much the entire video so far, and while I think that it's deserved praise, Devil May Cry is over 20 years old. There are aspects of the experience that have definitely shown its age. The game uses a fixed camera, and while it works fine for the most part, there are a few hiccups here that can detract from the gameplay. The camera angles change whenever you cross invisible lines, and when this happens, the controls can get a bit screwy. Let me explain. Let's say you're running down a hallway, and the camera shifts behind Dante's back at a certain point. point. Even though the analog stick is still pointing downwards, Dante is now heading in a different direction thanks to this new perspective. This is why you'll sometimes see me jitter for a second after a camera change. That's just me reorientating the analog stick for a new perspective. In terms of exploration, this system is fine. It's when this happens during combat is when I take issues. There are a few points in this game where the camera will switch during a combat scenario, and it can be very disorientating when it happens. Since there are moves that rely on the positioning of the analog stick to perform, if the camera angle changes, it's up in the air whether I should hold a different direction on the stick or not. It makes performing moves like Stinger and High Roller feel unnatural during a camera change because of the sudden shift in perspective. Another issue created by the fixed camera is the points where the perspective ends up obscuring enemies from your view. This happens a bit too often to ignore and can lead to some moments where you end up attacking off-screen enemies. This issue is somewhat circumvented by using the manual lock-on, but it's still not something I can overlook. Another issue I have is with the weapon switching. To switch weapons, you need to pause the game, select the weapon you want to change, then pick which weapon you want to replace it with. While you can switch your melee weapons by clicking the right stick, it comes with a second-long animation, which means it can't be used to change weapons mid-combo. Guns can also only be changed through this menu, which brings things to a screeching halt and discourages me from wanting to experiment in the middle of combat. I don't mind doing this outside of battle, but I wish that there was a less clumsy way of accomplishing this. The last issue I have to mention is a pretty minor one, but it was annoying nonetheless. As I mentioned earlier, Devil May Cry has a manual lock-on feature. It's pretty standard stuff. You use it to aim your guns and perform specific attacks. However, even if you aren't using the manual lock-on, there's still some form of auto-targeting in play that will cause Dante to attack the nearest enemy. This works well for regular encounters and most boss battles, but there's one fight in particular that presents a problem. One of the last bosses introduced is Nightmare. In order to deal damage to it, you need to attack these panels on the wall until they light up. This will reveal its true form for a limited time, and from then on you need to attack its exposed core. The auto lock-on always considers the boss the main priority, and you'll always take a swing at it unless you're right up against the wall. This game really could have done without the auto targeting, because if I wanted to attack a specific enemy, I would just point the analog stick towards them or use the manual lock-on. Having both is pretty redundant, but on the plus side, some of the jankier aspects of the gameplay can be used to your advantage. Normally, the shotgun has a pretty low fire rate. You have to wait for the second long reload animation before you can fire another shot. However, if you move slightly after shooting, you can skip that animation and shoot earlier than you usually would. This technique is affectionately referred to as shotgun twitching. The grenade launcher has a similar exploit where you roll after firing a shot to skip the reload animation. However, one of my favorite techniques has to be shotgun hiking. It's a way to keep demons suspended indefinitely in the air. It doesn't work on all enemies and requires a bit of timing to get down, but it's super gratifying to do and looks really cool. And you know what? That's one of my favorite parts about this game. Devil May Cry's combat mechanics cater to two types of players: the more intrinsically motivated crowd that just wants to mess around with the systems and craft stylish combos, even if they aren't the most effective, and the more extrinsically motivated players that are looking to be rewarded for playing well. The game uses positive reinforcement to encourage the player to master its mechanics, rewarding them with currency to unlock new moves and upgrade their health bar and devil trigger gauge. Its systems are simple enough for anyone to understand, but offers so much depth beyond the surface level that it becomes irresistible to try to push your skills. Something that I always look forward to when visiting the origins of a long-running franchise is seeing the concepts that would eventually be dropped in later entries. Devil May Cry 1 has a certain feel to it that no other game in the series has replicated. Its previous life as a scrapped Resident Evil game lends the environments a dark, almost gothic feel to them. Unlike the later games in the series, Devil May Cry 1 isn't afraid to slow down a bit and let you soak in the atmosphere. Another carryover from the Resident Evil games is the interconnected world design. Despite the large focus on action, there's a bit of exploration to be had. You're meant to find key items so you can progress through Malay Island. You'll go from the castle to the forest, the sunken ship, Colosseum, and even the underworld itself. Don't get me wrong, the exploration is not nearly as intense or as complex as classic Resident Evil is. There's no inventory management, and you're encouraged to fight every enemy you come across instead of strategically picking your battles. It's just that the roots of those games are still clearly present here, and that gives DMC1 a distinct feel separate from the entries that came after it. Something I'm kinda glad was dropped from the later games, however, is the forced gameplay variety. Strangely enough, there are first-person underwater segments in this game, and what's even weirder is that they feature combat with this harpoon gun you find in the sunken ship. The controls are awkward. You use the left stick to aim the camera and tap the jump button to swim forward. but when you're holding the lock-on button to ready the harpoon gun, you're suddenly unable to move the camera and are instead put into this sluggish strafing mode. There is a generous auto-aim so you don't have to be super precise with your shots, but this makes the underwater combat feel uninvolved. Encounters basically boil down to mashing the shoot button and occasionally veering in another direction to dodge enemy fire. It's not anything I would call engaging. To be fair, there are only a handful of swimming sections and they only last for a few minutes each. It's at the very least better than the random spacesuiter segment at the start of the Moondness boss fight. For a game all about its complex melee combat and mechanical depth, it's a strange decision to build the final boss around a completely new gameplay style. The second half of the boss fight is more in line with what you would expect, but I'm not sure what the idea was behind the first phase. It's treated as a triumphant moment where Dante unlocks his new devil trigger, so maybe it was done to give this fight a sense of scale. However, I would have preferred it if the entire boss fight was centered around the game's main combat system instead. Devil May Cry 1 is only a few hours long, and it's constantly introducing new enemies and giving you new tools to play around with. The gameplay always stays fresh because of this, which makes the inclusion of the aforementioned gimmicky segments feel more intrusive than anything. That's not to say that there isn't any good variety here. While exploring the map, you'll occasionally come across secret missions. There are many challenges that ask you to apply the mechanics of the game in more situational ways, such as getting enemies to kill each other with friendly fire, or using the enemy step technique to obtain an item. Secret missions award you with blue orb fragments upon finishing the challenge, and once you collect enough of them, your maximum health increases. You're going to want to have as much health as possible if you plan on playing any of the higher difficulties. There's no traditional difficulty selection per se, rather, the difficulty increases by one level with each New Game Plus run, with the most challenging difficulty being Dante Must Die mode. The later difficulties are a lot more than just percentage modifiers, since they go as far as to change enemy formations and even introduce new gameplay ideas, such as giving demons a devil trigger of their own. I'm personally not skilled enough to play DMC1 on Dante Must Die. The furthest I've gotten is to the third Nello Angelo fight on hard, and I thought that fight was brutal enough. I would like to try it out one day, but I'm not in any sort of rush. As a whole, Devil May Cry 1 is still a pretty good game, all things considered. Even after all of these years, the core gameplay still holds up rather well, even if the cracks are much more apparent due to its age. The camera is undoubtedly the biggest offender, since there are a few times where the angles given do a poor job at showing the action. This can lead to moments where you take unfair damage because the enemy was either hard to see or was off screen. Weapon switching is also a bit cumbersome, which makes it less likely that you're going to experiment in the middle of battle. However, those are just a few minor blemishes on what is otherwise a very solid gameplay experience. It's hard to think of many other games back in the day that not only played like Devil May Cry, but also provided an incentive to master their mechanics to the extent that this game does. The foundation set here would not only go on to influence the rest of the series, but action games as a whole. While it's not hard to find titles nowadays that are mechanically richer and offer more content, there's just a certain charm and feel to this game that keeps me coming back to it, which to me is what makes Devil May Cry 1 a classic. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I'd like to give a special shout out to all of my channel supporters whose names are on screen now. It's because of these lovely people that I'm able to make videos at the pace I do currently. These videos take a while to make, so if you're at all interested in helping out and donating, you can do so through my Patreon or channel memberships. I have a few things I can offer in return, such as early video access, a special Discord role, and even some behind the scenes content on occasion. Every donation helps, and if these rewards sound interesting to you, then you can find out more by following links in the description. I know that this video was a bit different from what you're used to seeing on this channel, but I'm very passionate about the DMC series and would love to cover the other games if you're at all interested in seeing that. Also, the next video is going to be on Digital Devil Saga 2. I've already gotten a head start on recording footage for that video, so you can expect to see that sooner or later. Something that I want to improve on this year is trying to get myself on a more consistent schedule. Last year, I was averaging around one video per month, and while that's fine, I think I found a few ways to increase the efficiency of my video production. Currently, I'm aiming for one video every 2 weeks, which I think is a pretty realistic goal. If you want to stay up to date with that in upcoming videos, then I encourage you to follow my Twitter or join my Discord server. Both will be linked in the description. Once again, I'd like to thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all next time.